It's 6:48, and I'd like to go back to where we started tonight, the question of who gets to vote and how much difference it would make. What would happen, for instance, if 16 and 17-year-olds were suddenly able to do so, or if all those people born abroad but with residency here were able to do so? Well, I'm joined now by the doyen Don himself, Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. John, good to see you there. Can I ask you, first of all, whether you were at all surprised by Jacob Rees-Mogg's comments about gerrymandering this afternoon?
Well, I certainly don't think it improves the tone of political debate. Of course, one has to be very careful about casting these kinds of aspersions. This would certainly not be the first time that the franchise has been changed in a way that the opposition thinks is to their disadvantage. We could go back to the 1980s. The then Conservative government allowed those people who were British subjects but living abroad for up to a length of time to be able to vote back at home. Actually, that didn't get that far because for a very long time, most of them didn't bother to register. But certainly the Labour Party felt this was an attempt by the Conservatives to get expats to be voting in British elections.
On the other side of the political divide, there's been an absolute explosion of outrage about the Labour Party proposals on 16 and 17-year-olds and, as you say, on EU and other expats voting. But I just wonder, you're speaking from Scotland, and I wonder how big a revolution it felt in Scotland when it happened there.
Well, let's disentangle this a little bit. The Labour Party has been in favour of votes for 16 and 17-year-olds since towards the end of the last Labour government. The House of Commons in 2013 voted in favour, and the truth is it's long been the case that the only party that's opposed is the Conservatives. Now, and of course, when votes for 16 and 17-year-olds were first introduced in Scotland, which was for the independence referendum, not dissimilar aspersions were cast about the motivations of the SNP at that time. Now, the truth is, at some point, you have to sit down and do some fairly boring calculations, what I've done this afternoon. So if you take the population data, right, and you kind of use that to estimate how many people will get added to the register, well, perhaps it's going to be between 2.5% and 3% of the names added to the register, which perhaps means somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 people might be eligible to be added to the register if they were to all register. And we know that 16 and 17-year-olds are
per constituency.
Certainly somewhat less likely to turn out and vote. True, age is at the moment the biggest demographic divide in our politics. Younger voters are much keener on Labour than our older voters. Last election, just over 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted for Labour, only between a fifth and a quarter for the Conservatives. So let's say this might give the Labour Party some 150 extra votes in the average constituency, but equally maybe 250, 300 will vote for Labour. And you can realise it has to be a pretty marginal constituency before the 16 and 17-year-olds are going to make much difference. And that was much the same calculation in Scotland back in 2014.
John, you put it like that, and the whole thing does seem a bit marginal, and the Conservatives getting upset disproportionately to the proposal. But there's something else going on here as well. If you look at the protests already beginning to build, the Conservative fear is clearly that a Labour or Lib-Lab coalition would change the voting system and lock the Conservatives out of power for a very, very long time. We had protests saying we could end up with a one-party state, which was slightly strange given that we've had the Conservatives in power for quite so long. Do you think the Conservatives are right to be worried about a big change like that being sprung on the British after the next election?
Well, Sir Keir, we're talking about changing the first past the post electoral system to some form of proportional representation. Although the Labour Party conference has now voted in favour of that change, Sir Keir Starmer has set his face against it. And it's only going to happen if in some certain circumstances the Labour Party has to rely on the Liberal Democrats for their support, and that certainly wouldn't occur in the immediate wake of a hung parliament. But the honest truth is, for all the speculation about a hung parliament in the last week, I would argue that a hung parliament is much less likely to happen now than it was 12 months ago. 12 months ago, when Labour had a 7-8 point lead, and with the SNP certainly in a stronger position than they are at the moment in Scotland, a hung parliament looked by far and away the most likely outcome. Now the Labour Party, as they themselves argue, have at least at this point in time, at least a reasonable chance of getting an overall majority. And in those circumstances, it looked as though Sir Keir would not visit on the Conservatives what perhaps they most fear. Because at the end of the day, the calculation the Labour Party always makes about these things is, do we think we can still win under the current system? And lo and behold, what we discover is that when the Labour Party does win under the current system, as in 1997, they suddenly forget their interest in electoral reform, which they certainly had in the run-up to the 1997 general election.
It's happened again and again and again. And indeed, we've seen the Labour lead actually increase since those local elections nationally.